Imagine spending 800 years slowly falling over and somehow never actually hitting the ground. That is not a metaphor. That is the real, true story of one of the most famous buildings on Earth. A tower that was never supposed to lean at all, and yet became world famous for the very mistake that almost destroyed it. What you are about to hear is not just a story about bricks and stone. It is a story about arrogance, war, secret cover-ups, a dictator's ego, and a team of engineers who had exactly one shot to save something the entire world was watching. If they got it wrong, hundreds of years of history would collapse in seconds. So stay with me, because the ending of this story...
To understand how this all began, we have to go back long before any tower existed, to a quiet river flowing through the Italian city of Pisa. Rivers are unpredictable things. They shift, they wander, they change direction over centuries, and wherever they go, they leave behind traces of sand, silt, and soft earth. Millions of years before construction ever started, this particular river did not flow where it flows today. It moved slowly across the land, leaving loose, waterlogged soil buried beneath what looked from the surface like solid and dependable ground. Nobody could see it, nobody could test it properly, and nobody had any idea that this invisible flaw beneath their feet would one day make history. In the year 1173, construction began on what was meant to be something simple and beautiful, a bell tower standing beside a grand cathedral. Back then, it was tradition that church bells were not housed inside the main building itself, but in a separate tower nearby, tall enough for the sound to travel across the whole city. The engineers of that era were skilled, proud, and confident in their methods. They dug a foundation about 3 meters deep, filled it with stone, and believed with total certainty that this would be more than enough to support the structure they were about to build. They had no idea that beneath their feet lay soft, saturated ground that had been quietly waiting to betray them. At first, everything seemed to go exactly to plan. The first floor rose smoothly, built from elegant marble and solid stone, and there was no sign yet of the disaster to come. But by the time construction reached the 3rd floor in 1178, the true nature of the ground beneath the tower finally revealed itself. The soft soil left behind by that ancient river began to compress unevenly under the growing weight above it. One side of the unfinished tower began sinking faster than the other, and slowly, almost silently, it started to tilt. The engineers were stunned. They had built with confidence, and now the ground itself was rebelling again.
Right when the engineers were desperately trying to understand what was happening and how to fix it, war broke out between Pisa and its neighboring territories. Construction had to stop completely, and what could have been a disaster actually became an unexpected stroke of luck. That war paused the project for almost 100 years. During that time, the tower sat quietly, unfinished and tilted, but its existing weight slowly allowed the soft ground beneath it to settle and stabilize. If the war had never happened, and builders had kept stacking more weight on top without pause, many experts believe the tower would have collapsed completely within those very same 100 years. Sometimes, the worst circumstances accidentally save you.
Nearly a century later, in 1272, a new generation of engineers and architects picked up where the old ones had left off. By this point, the tower was already leaning noticeably to the south, and the obvious solution would have been to tear it down and start over correctly. But instead, these builders made a strange and now famous decision. They reasoned that since 3 floors were already crooked, they could simply build the 4th floor straighter to compensate, making larger stones on the leaning side and smaller stones on the opposite side, hoping this clever trick would visually correct the tilt. It sounds almost logical on paper, but nature does not care about clever tricks, and what happened next proved that completely.
As they continued building upward toward the 7th floor, using this same compensating method, the growing weight of the tower pressed the soft ground even further out of balance. Instead of straightening the structure, this technique caused the tower to curve unnaturally, almost like a slightly bent banana rather than a straight column. Even today, if you look closely at the real tower, you can see that it is not simply tilted in one straight line. It actually curves partway through its height, a permanent physical record of an ancient engineering decision that backfired in the most visible way possible, frozen in stone for the entire world to study.
Just as construction reached the 7th floor, war broke out once again in 1278, forcing yet another long pause in the project. It would take until the year 1360, nearly 200 years after the original foundation was first dug, for the final floor, the bell chamber itself, to finally be completed. And even at this final stage, the builders continued the exact same compensating trick from before, deliberately making the southern wall taller than the northern one to visually balance the lean. The clearest proof of this intentional adjustment still exists today, because one side of the bell chamber has 4 steps leading up to it, while the other side has 6. This detail tells us something remarkable. The architects working on that final floor knew perfectly well that their tower was leaning, and rather than admit defeat, they tried to quietly hide it by shifting the bell chamber closer to the tower's central axis. It was, in a sense, one of history's earliest architectural cover-ups. But despite every clever adjustment and hidden correction, the lean continued to grow steadily worse with each passing year. Construction officially ended in 1372, yet the story of the tower's slow and dramatic tilt was only just beginning, and it would take centuries more before anyone truly understood how dangerous the situation had become. The first time anyone actually measured the tilt precisely was in 1817, and the number came back at 4.5 degrees, already a serious and visible lean. For a long time after that, the tower's foundation remained safely buried beneath the ground, protected from disturbance. But in 1834, an architect made a decision that seemed harmless at the time. He excavated the earth around the base of the tower to create a walkway, allowing visitors to step down and admire the ancient foundation up close. It seemed like a wonderful way to celebrate the building's history. But this excavation quietly increased the tilt by another 1/4 degree, proving once again how fragile and unpredictable this structure truly was. A century later, in 1934, the Italian dictator of that era developed a personal obsession with correcting the tower's appearance, viewing the lean as an embarrassment rather than a marvel. He ordered holes drilled into the tower's northern foundation and had 90 tons of concrete pumped directly into the ground beneath it, fully convinced this would eliminate the tilt entirely. Instead, the exact opposite happened. The added weight forced the southern foundation to sink even deeper into the soft earth, pushing the tilt to a frightening 5 degrees. And for years afterward, engineers could not find a way to stop the tower from continuing to lean and lean further and further with each passing season.
By 1950, something remarkable had happened, almost by accident. What began as an engineering embarrassment had transformed the tower into one of the most visited tourist destinations in all of Italy. People traveled from every corner of the world just to witness this strange, tilting structure with their own eyes, treating it almost like a miracle rather than a mistake. For decades, this fascination continued to grow, and very few people stopped to consider just how genuinely dangerous the situation beneath their feet actually was. The tower had become beloved precisely because of the flaw that nearly destroyed it centuries earlier.
Then, in 1989, everything changed in a single, terrifying moment. A similar ancient tower in another Italian city suddenly collapsed without warning, sending shockwaves of fear through the entire country. If one leaning tower could fall so unexpectedly, what did that mean for the most famous leaning tower of all? The following year, in 1990, officials measured the tilt and discovered it had reached a genuinely alarming 5.5 degrees. For the very first time in its long history, the tower was completely closed to the public, and even the bells themselves were removed from the top to reduce any unnecessary additional weight pressing down on the fragile structure. This was the exact moment when the world's most famous leaning tower could have collapsed at almost any time without warning, with no guarantee of survival. In response, Italy assembled an elite team of engineers and structural experts, giving them one single, overwhelming responsibility: to save this tower from total destruction before it was too late. Their very first move was to construct a reinforced concrete ring around the base of the tower and place 600 tons of counterweight on its raised northern side. Remarkably, this immediately stopped the tilt from increasing any further and even reduced the angle slightly, offering the very first glimmer of genuine hope in this entire crisis. But everyone involved understood that this counterweight was only ever meant to be a temporary solution, not a permanent fix. The visible steel weights were unattractive, and more importantly, they could not hold the tower steady forever on their own. In 1995, engineers proposed something far more ambitious. 40 meters beneath the surface lay solid, stable bedrock, and their plan was to anchor the tower's foundation to that bedrock using powerful steel cables, essentially replicating the effect of the counterweight in a much more permanent and elegant way. If this technique succeeded, it could finally offer a lasting solution to a problem that had plagued this structure for over 800 years. There was just one enormous obstacle standing in their way. The ground beneath the tower was still soft, waterlogged, and unstable. Exactly the same kind of soil that had caused this entire disaster in the first place, all those centuries earlier. If engineers tried to dig down toward the bedrock using normal methods, water would rush out of the earth, causing the surrounding soil to collapse even further inward, creating an immediate and serious risk to the tower's stability. To solve this specific problem, the team made a bold and unusual decision. They chose to inject liquid nitrogen directly into the ground surrounding the tower's foundation, a substance so cold it could instantly freeze everything it touched, including the water hidden deep within the soil itself.
The plan seemed brilliant in theory. By freezing the ground solid, engineers believed they could safely drill through it without triggering any dangerous collapse, creating a stable path all the way down to the bedrock below. But what actually happened next terrified the entire team. As the water inside the frozen ground began to freeze, it expanded, exactly the way water always does when it turns to ice. This sudden expansion on the tower's northern side pushed additional pressure onto the already struggling southern foundation. And in a devastating twist, the tower's tilt actually increased even further during this exact procedure, threatening to undo years of careful, painstaking progress.
Engineers reacted immediately, rushing 300 additional tons of weight onto the northern side in a desperate attempt to counteract the sudden shift and bring the angle back under control. It looked promising on paper, but unfortunately, this emergency fix was never properly tested, and the entire liquid nitrogen procedure had to be abandoned and reversed as quickly as possible. At this critical point, the tilt had climbed to an extremely dangerous level, and new calculations revealed something absolutely chilling. If the total weight increased by even 7...
With time running out and no room left for further mistakes, the engineering team gathered once more to search for any possible solution that could still save this ancient structure. Eventually, they arrived at a technique known as under-excavation, a careful and precise method involving angled guide drills placed beneath the tower's foundation to slowly extract small amounts of soil from underneath it. As the resulting empty space naturally collapsed inward, the tower would gradually straighten itself under its own weight, almost like nature correcting the very mistake it had originally caused all those centuries earlier beneath that ancient wandering river. This method carried enormous risk, because if even one of those angled drills was positioned incorrectly, the tower could tilt in a completely different, unpredictable direction instead of straightening safely. Understandably, the engineers were extremely cautious before attempting this final high-stakes option, since there would be no opportunity to undo a serious mistake once it had already happened. To minimize that risk as much as possible, they first built a separate cylindrical test model nearby, roughly 7 meters wide, and practiced the entire under-excavation technique repeatedly on that model before ever touching the real historic tower itself.
Their earliest attempts on the test model were far from perfect, and it took several careful adjustments before the team finally discovered the correct angle needed for consistent, controlled results. Even after finding success on their test model, engineers still refused to take any unnecessary chances with the genuine tower, securing it firmly with steel cables connected to counterweights before beginning any real drilling work. They started extremely small, targeting just one limited area and removing soil from only about 1 meter beneath the foundation. Remarkably, this careful, cautious approach worked exactly as intended, shifting the tower a small but crucial 1/10 of a degree back in the correct, safer direction. Encouraged by this first genuine success, the team expanded their efforts significantly,
eventually using 41 separate guide drills and carefully removing soil from a 2-meter area beneath the historic foundation. From this point forward, the tower began steadily and reliably straightening itself in the correct direction, month after month, giving everyone involved real, tangible hope for the very first time in years. In fact, engineers realized they now possessed enough control over the process to straighten the tower completely if they truly wanted to, technically undoing 8 centuries of dramatic, world-famous tilting in one final, decisive push.
But then came an unexpected twist that surprised almost everyone watching this story unfold. Italian authorities ultimately decided against fully straightening the tower, fearing that doing so would strip away the very unique identity that made millions of tourists travel across the entire world just to see it. Instead of erasing the flaw completely, they deliberately chose to stabilize the tower at a safer, carefully calculated angle of 3.97 degrees, reduced significantly from that terrifying 5.5-degree danger zone, while still preserving its unmistakable, world-famous lean for future generations to admire and enjoy.
After being closed off from the public for 10 long years, the tower was finally reopened on December 15th in 2001, marking an emotional and historic moment for the entire city of Pisa and for visitors everywhere. There was still one final lingering concern that engineers needed to permanently address before truly considering their mission complete. Tests revealed there was noticeably more underground water concentrated on the tower's northern side compared to the south, a subtle imbalance that could potentially create serious new problems again at some unknown point far in the future if it was simply left ignored and unmanaged.
To solve this last remaining risk once and for all, engineers dug 3 carefully placed wells on the northern side of the tower, designed specifically to collect any excess underground water before it could accumulate and cause further uneven settling beneath the structure. This clever, forward-thinking solution ensured that water levels beneath both sides of the tower would remain balanced and equal moving forward, permanently protecting the delicate stability that so many brilliant engineers had fought so hard for so many years to finally achieve after centuries of uncertainty. Today, that same reinforced concrete ring still surrounds the base, quietly holding everything steady beneath the surface.
What makes this story so genuinely remarkable is not simply that a famous tower leans, but everything that happened behind the scenes to keep it standing at all. A tiny, invisible flaw.
Perhaps that is the real lesson hidden inside this incredible true story. Sometimes the very things we consider mistakes, flaws, or imperfections become exactly what makes something unforgettable and irreplaceable in the eyes of the entire world. The Leaning Tower of Pisa was never supposed to lean at all, yet today it stands as one of the most recognized and beloved structures on the planet, precisely because of that unintended flaw. It is a powerful reminder that sometimes the things we work hardest to hide are the very things worth protecting and celebrating instead of erasing.